It's not snowing yet. This is a good thing. Oh, it's sleeting. Well, okay, good to know. And on that topic, I actually have a new announcement. I find it very exciting when I make a new announcement. And that is when the library is closed because of the weather, there is no bucket course. It sort of would figure, wouldn't it? So listen to the radio and find out whether the library is open or closed, and then you'll know whether bucket course is meeting that day. That's one announcement. There's another new announcement, which you probably noticed, which is that we have China coffee cups instead of plastic. Woohoo! The thing is now not to kick them and break them, you know. But other than that, we've struck a blow for recycle, reuse, and no plastic, and stuff like that. So if you're using a tea coil, it's time to turn it on. If you haven't turned your phone off or to vibrate, it's time to do that. Oh, let me say also about questions today, before I turn it over to Professor Scott. It's fine, I think it's working fine for people to ask questions from the audience. Kesho is going to, in the ideal world, she's going to repeat the question so that everybody can hear it and so that it gets onto the video. If she should happen not to remember to repeat your question, I'm going to stand up and ask her to repeat the question. So that's how we'll go, instead of trying to take the mic around or that sort of thing, okay? I am delighted to welcome Professor Scott, Sociology and American Studies at the college. I am only sorry that I missed part one, but I'm excited for part two. So here we go.
Thank you. So this is part
You're
two.
not on.
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. I do have a loud voice, so I think everybody can hear me. Okay, how about now? Yeah. Great, okay, and I'll talk loud anyway because I'm loud. This is part two. And this part will pack a lot emotionally. And it will also have pockets of interaction. I want to remind you that this presentation was not at all designed to point fingers, make anybody feel guilty. It is a part of the history of humanity, part of the history of our country, and certainly part of the history of, you know, my people in particular as a descendant of a slave. Remember from our last interaction that slavery operated on 10 centuries and it was a global phenomenon, right? And there were multiple rubs. So we don't have time to look at all of those details, but this is a flavoring of how this experience operated in what we call the Black Holocaust. I also want to say that please participate to your own level of comfort in terms of the exercises, and there'll be one in which I'll ask 10 people to stand up, you'll see. So if you want to be one of those people, fine. If not, you'll do the other exercise. But be comfortable with whatever that you are willing to do. Slide 2, please. It's not working. Oh, okay. I can't seem to do my talk and do the slides. I can't do it. It comes with getting older. Alrighty. So here's what I want you to do. I want all the people who identify as women to read the first two on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Go. Out loud.
Define, capture, enslavement, transport, and disembarkment. Physical and psychological impact of these processes.
Thank you. Will the people identifying masculinity read 3 and 4, please?
Gender dynamics, companies, and beneficiaries.
So this is the scope of work that this particular talk, part 2, is about. Part 3 will focus more on the losses. What happened to Africa in terms of depopulation? And we'll spend the last 20 minutes of the class talking about lessons learned, best practices, and how we can spin this in a way where we reclaim aspects of humanity. Because certainly America or the West or any peoples in the world that have participated in any form of slavery, and slavery has existed in all societies throughout the human experience, that we have also gotten better. Societies have gotten better, and we have to remember that. So I want to end on a very positive note. Next slide, please. There was a movie that came out in 1977 based on Alec Haley's Roots book. And how many people saw that? Raise your hand. Oh my goodness, this is so classic.
I read the book before the day it came out.
Absolutely. It was by Alex Haley, who also wrote the book about Malcolm X, Malcolm X's autobiography. And this book was about the saga of an American family that begins in Africa. And I remember, too, being glued to the television. I was a community college teacher at that time, and I remember lying to get out of teaching so that I could stay home so that I could watch that. Because when I was teaching at that time, we had 5 classes a semester, so that is how zealous I was at teaching at the time. But what's important is that Lamar Burton, who was the key actor, do you remember what character he played?
Quentin
Oh my goodness, you all are right on it. Okay, stars. The movie begins, if you can imagine this, with kind of an average African family having their son being stolen as he was doing his sheep herding. And the rest of the story is about the first part of what we're going to talk about, and that is capture. It won 37 Primetime Emmys, a Golden Globe, a Peabody Award, and it had the highest Nielsen ratings, the 3rd highest for the final episode of any television program up until that time, and the 2nd most watched TV series in the history of the United States. So imagine that, in my mind, everybody put your hands up like this. Slavery has been one of those issues. Seriously, I love it, you're doing it. Slavery has been one of those issues in which people don't want to talk about it, right? But this is a moment in which an institution, a television program, brought people together talking about it. And I remember that it moved away from being a dirty word and a dirty process and a hidden process to one in which people were prepared to talk about it. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about capture. Right? Capture means to grab, to trap, to take something and that doesn't want to be taken. I want you to recognize that this process of being captured has a lot to do with those 100 million people that were enslaved and taken from Africa over those 10th centuries. I want you to repeat after me this word. Say, what? Can you do that? What? You all did it better than the group that I just did. I did it at the Martin Luther King talk at Beloit College for my daughter. And I was trying to get them to do what with an attitude, and they couldn't manage it. So you all were beautiful. But I want to give you 7 reasons that had to do with how people were captured. And when I give you one, I want you to say what. Got that? All right, number 1, obviously people were prisoners of war.
What?
People were tributes.
What?
That means that they were given as gifts to the victor of the war. So you would have to give 500 slaves to whoever the victor was. So it was a tribute. Number 3, they were criminals.
What?
Absolutely. Number 4, kidnapped.
What?
Number 5, debt repayment.
What?
Yes, religious service.
What?
There were many institutions that required that communities and families give a daughter or a son to the religious institution and serve that. So people were given away as servants or enslaved people to whatever that institution is. In Ghana, that's called Trakasi, the institution of Trakasi, and people would give their second daughter always to the church. How about this one, my favorite? Being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
What?
Absolutely. So these were some of the ways in which enslaved Africans found themselves captured. And when they were captured, they lost their community stance and their family life. They were either sold, given away, or isolated. Now, early European maritime traders acquired African slaves along the trade routes. They were purchased at various ports along where there were Arab hubs and African hubs for trading captives. And one of the things that's really interesting is that many of us don't know African history, so we don't realize that there were kingdoms and empires also in parts of Africa. And in West Africa, there were the Mali, the Ghana, the Congo, and the Songhai empires. And they had been fighting, come on, let's do this, hands up. They had been fighting for as many centuries as the Europeans had fought. They were as highly feudalistic and warlike as the Europeans were. And they had already, aspects of their society had begun to destabilize because they were in war with each other for centuries, right? And one of the reasons that war was so important is that war was always about, put your hands up, expanding your land terrain, creating more different kinds of ethnic people which become part of your nation state, which means you had to have a greater mechanism for controlling those people, right? So, you know, the West was not the only place in the world that created that mechanism of feudalism and increasing its society and finding its societies with multiple languages, multiple religions. It had its internal diversity, and hands up, it imposed the dominant culture on whoever they enslaved. Are you following me? I want you to see that that process was part of the human experience. It wasn't just what happened in the West. So in knowing that it was as feudalistic from the 10th century to the 15th century, just like Europe, it means that they also had middlemen. In fact, without African middlemen, traders would not have been able to do the work that they ever would have been. I need to have a middleman. Somebody willing to do that? I need you to come up here and stand right over there. Oh, I know you're saying, oh my God, what in the hell is she going to have me do? All right. All right, just somebody, I need a middleman. Very good, love you. Good, there's our middleman. We're not gonna not like him yet. But without an African middleman, local traders would not have had the kind of access to the internal supplies of capturing Africans. They would have been able to stay on the periphery, right? So that Europeans did not go in. What is another reason Europeans did not go in? They didn't know the land. What else? They didn't know the language, right? They didn't know the customs, right? They didn't know the waterways. They didn't know those things. So most of the middlemen status were of African descent. So I want you to go right in the middle and stand there, because now we have given you a job. You have an elevated status. Very good. Yeah, that's right. You got an elevated status. So, in your job, African traders had a lot of reasons to be part of the African slave trade. Many of the African suppliers were operating out of fear, right? Because if they did not participate, then they themselves would be enslaved. The transatlantic route from the west to the central was forcibly marched. So I need to have 10 people stand up. Not 10. Let's just do 5. 5 people. Are you willing to stand up? Please. Oh, very good. I love it. All right. Okay. And would you get behind our middle person here? Right. And hold on to each other's waists. Very good. Because he's going to march your butt right into slavery. That's what he's going to do. Right? And here is the catch. Many times they didn't know what was happening. Right? All right. Hold on. Now you march them right out to where they are going to have contact with, right over there by the wall. Ah, very good. Very good. March them over there. All right. Now, I need to have 2 African traders. Quickly. Come this way. Yeah, leave them by the wall, and you go back and be a middleman. Very good. All righty. All right. Are you going to be a trader? You going to be a trader? Very good. Now, get behind her, and she's going to march you to the ship all the way there. But you don't know that. Take them right to the hub. Very good. No. Right. And they're saying, no, but take them right over there. So, this is the process of capture. We sometimes don't talk about it, and we don't realize that it was a very sophisticated system. Right? That in being able to capture them, they had to have places where they could be stored, right? And sometimes these, this process, they would have, this was called a strand, right? And a strand could have up to 40 people, and they could have a dozen strands in one route. And they could have 20 traffickers operating within the course of a week. Are you following me? That's a lot of
Is
people.
that the first picture up there?
Yes, would be an example of this. So I want you to understand the magnitude of this institution. We sometimes think of it as just people hopping around and whatever happened. This was well thought out, this was extremely well planned, and it was extremely efficient. Let's give them an applause. The middleman, you can't go again, so have a seat. We're gonna work some more. So this is what it looked like. These strands were integrated in terms of having males and females. For the slaves that were, the enslaved peoples that were more resistant, they put things over their mouths so that they wouldn't bite the leather that held them tight. They shackled their feet and they shackled their hands, and they were chained together. Many of them also were carrying heavy weights that carried the supplies that fed them along the way, right? Because sometimes these routes took longer than just 2 weeks, all right? And so they had to walk, they had to stop, and they had to walk, and they had to stop, all right? So capture, put your hand up, is number one. That is one of the stages of this process. Before they get anywhere that they're going in the world, they had to be captured first. The death of many, you've heard this before. How many people have ever heard this? That the death of American Indians due to disease was one of the reasons that they weren't as fit for doing this kind of work, and it floored the African slave trade. Anybody heard that? Raise your hand. Yeah, this is one of the things they teach it classically in the textbooks. We don't know whether that is true or not, but what we do know is that the simultaneity of trying to get indigenous people in the communities that were later explored by European exploration, when they weren't able to work, then it fueled the enslavement of Africans. There was also a second reason, and that was the demand for production of tobacco and sugar tripled in Europe, right? Once they could grow it, then, and the desire, you know, law of supply and demand, if people want it, then we're going to have it more. So this increased the need to have more slaves, right? Which meant, in many ways, that the plantation situations, the death rates were high. Now, I want to give you a shocking figure. They estimated that most of the slaves that were brought to the Americas, they weren't expected to live. They weren't creating settlement communities. They were to come, do the work, and die within a couple of years, and they were easily replaceable. There wasn't this idea that they were going to settle and associate and interconnect. Not at all, right? So they didn't have burials, they didn't get married, they didn't have housing, they didn't get names, they weren't counted. In the first 100 and 150 years, they were just products of getting the work done for the production, right? Okay? They weren't expected. And out of the 12 million enslaved population that came to the New World, most of them came to Brazil. They didn't even come to what we now call the part of the United States, where by the time slaves moved to the Caribbean, they were creating more what they call communities of slaves, where slaves were then having families and reproducing. We're not at that point yet. In the capture to later what we're going to see is transport and then settlement and disembarkment, you're going to see that they didn't expect them to live. They expected them to die. Right? Okay. All right. I want you to now turn to a partner next to you and say to them what has blown your mind so far. All right? Middleman, get ready because I'm going to have you doing something. What has blown your mind so far? I have a glass of water. Now, will you turn the next slide?
Yeah.
2 people to comment, and I want 1 question to be formulated. All right? So which are you going to be? Where are my 2 commenters? And who's going to formulate a question? Yeah. Don't let me start doing this. I know some of you.
I've got a question.
Good. Let's start with your question.
What's that thing around their neck with a barbie or hook type thing on?
What it is it was a kind of mask.
Would you repeat?
Yes. What is the thing that is around the neck in the middle picture that seems to control their mouth, right? It was a piece of technology that was designed so that the slave could take something liquid, but the more they resisted, it would choke them, right? So technologies were developed for the purpose of capture, right? Okay? Because who in their right mind would create these things unless you wanted them to have this function, right? And so when you actually visit the slave castles, you can actually see some of the actual technology. They estimated, for an example, that the chains that were around weighed something like 8 pounds, right? They had to carry 8 pounds. So, and those 8 pounds that they carried when they walked actually made them stronger. It's like, that sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Like weightlifting, right? You wouldn't think of it as something, but it actually helped them, right? It helped them digest their food, it helped them be stronger so that they could make those journeys to those hubs, so they could be in those castles, so they can get on those ships, so they can go wherever they were going to be shipped. Got that? All right, great question. All right, 2 comments. What's going on in your minds thus far? What's been a aha for you, a surprise? Because I'm getting ready to go very fast now. And my middle person has to get ready to do this again. Yes?
The expectation that they weren't going to live.
All right.
Would you repeat?
Yes. I asked what was it that blew her mind, and they said that the expectation that they were not going to live. They weren't expected to live. All right? Good. Someone else. I need 1 more person. Yes?
Impact of one person's movement on the entire line of people. One falls, the others follow suit.
Absolutely. You know, there's this idea that they had keys, right? Sometimes they didn't use that technology till they got to ships. But what they would do is they would cut that person from those lines, and they would let them die, because they weren't legally responsible for any person that they captured. And what you're going to see later down the line in the presentation is how much insurance they had on every slave that they were able to bring. So we're going to see the companies that were involved in insuring slaves, even though they weren't even there yet, right? So because we had to know how people made money on that end, right? Okay, can I go on? All right, hold your question. Can you hold your question? Good. All right, next slide. All right, I'm going to go fast now. So there's this real debate as to whether these things are castles or dungeons. Certainly, it's about from whose point of view, right? From if this side of the room are the owners of this technology, the slave castle, then to you it's a castle. But if you're living in the bottom of that dungeon, it is not a castle to you, right? So West Africa had about 40 slave castles, dungeons, from Senegal to Ghana. That's a large spread of West Africa. The 2 oldest castles were the Elmina Castle and the Cape Coast Castle. The Elmina Castle was built in 1492, and as of now, it is 537 years old. The Cape Coast Castle was built in 1610, and these 2 were particular hubs on the West Coast where inland enslaved people were brought, right, and dropped off and waited for ships. These hubs were in Benin, raise your hand if you've heard of some of these places. Benin, good. Liberia, Zanzibar, Gorée Island in Senegal, Bunce Island in Sierra Leone, all right? Good. So that meant that when a ship moved along a coast, they picked up more slaves and they moved, right? What did I say? Repeat after me. Designed system for capture. Next slide. What then is the history of a dungeon? A dungeon is a dark place cell founded underground in a room in a castle. which is very, very different than a castle which maintain an aristocrat and their families and their servants and their warriors and all of those kinds of things. I'm not going to spend time reading this, but the point is I want you to think about, again, from whose perspective is this a dungeon and from whose perspective is this a castle? Next slide. If you notice that all of these castles also had weaponry. They had cannons. I had to ask my husband yesterday, what was the little round things that they had? He said cannonballs. Okay, so they had as many cannons as they had cannonballs. Why would they have this in a castle? Because they were already trading after they had spent the period of exploration. They were already in trading, and it was very prosperous, right? And other European countries began to be part of trading, and they were greedy, and they fought each other. So you'll take one castle, and you see that it had multiple owners and multiple people who renovated and multiple people who did trading. So by the time they began to trade in human cargo, they were using these cannons to fight each other. In fact, in one part of Africa, I can't remember testify, but you can actually look at one castle and see the other castle right down the beach. You know, and they were fighting each other because this was prosperous. So they were bringing something from Europe. They were trading it with the traders, with the middle person. Raise your hand again because you were the trader. You got the deals. You went and got slaves. Those slaves got on the boat. Those boats went to the Caribbean. And it was what again? Well-developed system to capture. Right? All right. I want to say that slave ships landed and refreshed themselves and restocked in some of those hub sites. And nearly 1/3 of all slave voyages came from 3 cities in particular. They came from Liverpool, London, Bristol, and other parts of Britain. 1/3. Again, repeat after me. Well-developed system of capture. Right? It's not fluky. It's business. Got that? Next slide. Slaves were captured, they were contained, and all slaves went through the door of no return. This is a picture of this is a picture of the door of no return, where they would go out on a landing and they would walk over a small sort of bridge, and then they would go into the bottom of the boat. This is actually what it looks like. They have covered it up with sort of the memorabilia of a door of no return. This is what a window looks like right next to it, so you can actually see out on the port. This is Barack Obama and Michelle Obama when they went, right after they became president. He became president of the United States. This is one of their first trips. And this here is the other door of no return. Because if you, in fact, went into this door, you were going to die. You were going to be no one's descendant. That meant that you were one of those enslaved persons that they could not capture and that they could not control, right? And would the middleman stand up again? Middleman was always the one who told the people who, in the slave castles, whisper in her ear, who are going to be the troublemakers. And they would eventually put them in the second door of return, because there was no sense taking a warrior on the ship to create what? Right, Reverend, have a seat. Give them an applause again. Thank you. Let's turn to the next slide. We did capture. Now let's do enslavement. I mean, certainly these ships didn't come every other day. They didn't shut down, but it took time for them to move across the Middle Passage and in different parts of the world. So enslavement means to be contained. It means to be kept. Something that is kept often in that Middle Passage could be up to 3 months between capture and enslavement. Many of them died by physical means. They were beaten, they were injured, and they couldn't survive their injuries while they were in the dungeons. Some of them physically went mad, all right? Okay, I want to have the 3 of you right here. I want you to shake your head like this. Just shake, yeah, just shake. They just went mad. Just keep shaking it, because you're crazy as hell. Just shake your head. Because after what you went through, many people wouldn't have made it. Do you understand? they would not have made it. There would be nothing in their psyche which would have prepared them for the experience that they would have had. Nothing. 200 slaves lived in a dungeon like this. This is what the dungeon looked like. There was no light. Often there was no electricity. There was no water. Mostly there was a teeny little light. There was no place for them to lay down. They urinated and peed where they were. And if you notice this dark area here, this is where they stood in filth for the time until a ship would come. All right? They had male dungeons and female dungeons. And the female and male dungeons, the ministration was part of the waste. And you could actually still go in and smell and see. They excavated some of the layers of dirt in these slave castles to see that this was the dynamic that they were put in. There were generally one or two small windows which brought in draft. It was dark 80% of the time. What did I say? 80% of the time, because dungeons are where? In the ground, all right, down in the basement. Men and women, as I said, were separated. Children were, any children that were between 11 and 13, they had a dungeon for the children that were within that age. So they stayed very gender specific. The average age for men was 16 to 30. The average age for women was 14 to 22. This is estimated because they were not asked what their language, what their age was, and what it is. They didn't know the languages that they spoke, so they were judged by these characteristics on the part of the Europeans. Women, as I said, added their ministration to what they stood in. And there were bars that were internal to this castle. So on the outside was all heavy, and it was the cement. But on the inside of the castle, where there was a corridor, and upstairs, then there were bars, right? And through those bars, they were fed, right? And they had to have systems in which they took that food. All right, next. Transport. We're going to stop at...
Yeah, I'll give you about 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Transport is the next stage. So let's go back over it. What was one? Capture. What was number two? Enslavement. What was number three? Transport. So now you have to have a well-developed system of transporting people, right? Okay? We talked about between 12 and 15 million people were transported in just the transatlantic slave. How many routes did we identify last time? Three, the dominant routes. I'm told that there were at least about 11, but the dominant routes were the three that we talked about. The Middle Passage took enslaved Africans away from their homeland. Portugal and Britain were the two most successful slave trading countries, accounting for about 70% of all Africans transported to the Americas. To the Americas. That means South America, what we now call South America and the Caribbean. Right? 20% of them died in sea. Some were estimated between 1.5 million. There was an extreme amount of suicide, and ships would often, on a regular basis, throw 5 or 6 people overboard a day. Sometimes it could be 20, because everybody suffered from dysentery, right? But sometimes, at least from the bottom in the dungeons and on the base of the ship where they were put together like this, and these are very famous kinds of pictures, they would throw away 5 to 7 slaves a day. While Europeans and Africans suffered, as I said, from dysentery, the leading cause of death for the sailors on the ship was malaria and yellow fever that they caught, which was something they didn't know, in the same way that they brought diseases to Africa, right? Hands out. So there was a proper disease exchange in which they were not immunized for, because there was no such thing. Each ship carried anywhere from, repeat after me, 250 to 600 enslaved people. 250 to 600 enslaved people. Most of the companies insured these ships so that whatever the numbers were, they got insurance money. We'll talk about that later. They were overcrowded, packed in like sardines and spoons. Come on, let's make spoons. You know how you lay your spoons together, right? Okay? They were packed like sardines. and there was no room to turn. Can you imagine for 3 weeks your next port on the bottom of that ship, not ever being able to turn, not being able to go to the bathroom, having to urinate on yourself, right? Okay? Which means that in their well-organized system in transport also, when slaves were taken off the ships, they were immediately cleaned, all right? So that they could be what? Sold. You got it. Sold again. Thank you. The Middle Passage sometimes, as I said, could take up to 3 months, and slaves were fed very little, not much, and sometimes they were fed corn, beans, yam, rice, palm oil, and sailors ate first. If the food went bad, slaves did not eat at all. All right? Okay. Next slide. Transport technologies. Approximately 1 slave ship in 10 experienced some form of African resistance. What did I say? 1 in what? 10. Faced with permanent threat of African resistance, the crew had to permanently be alert, hypervigilant, right? They had to know the middleman, start walking around, start telling people that they have to be wary and watch for these certain, slaves and these certain, because they're going to be problems. Especially that one over there that's tall. Yeah, watch that one over there. This increased their cruelty to the enslaved population because their goal was to bring as many alive as they could so that there would be money. All right? This system in which the sailors realized that if in fact they had to be in combat with the enslaved population, they were fighting for their lives also. Right? So here were 2 peoples fighting for their lives. Slaves were punished by whipping, shackling, hanging, beating, burning, mutilization, branding, rape, and imprisonment. Imprisonment was often meted out in response to disobedience as a tool to teach them, don't try to escape. Don't try to escape. But sometimes this abusive pattern turned against them, and slaves became more willing to risk their lives. I just want to say one thing that, let me see, where did I put it at? Death during the Middle Passage was caused by epidemics of, I said, hands out, those mixing of those diseases that were shared. Suicide was extremely high. Sometimes they would bite the neck. I have read a small portion of how they would bite each other's wrists so they would bleed to death if they couldn't jump off of the ship, right? Okay? Where are my mad people? Come on, shake your head. They would go mad, which means they would be dumped the next day. They felt a sense of melancholy on the 3. I want everybody to say, this drove other people mad to hear this all of the time. Mutiny was about 13% of the time. One more idea. So many bodies of the dead were jumped and shot over the ship every day that the slave ships used to be followed by pools of sharks because it was a common source of food. So I want to stop now and take our 10 minutes, but before I do, I want to have 2 people tell me what was an aha for them. What was a surprise for you? Yeah, what'd you learn? Yes, we'll get to you. You have a question. You want to make a comment or make a question?
Comment, well.
Go for it.
When you actually look at this picture, there is no reason for us to reasonably expect that those who purchased them saw them as anything but cattle.
Absolutely. So
and
the comment,
cattle
yes.
could be killed.
Right.
Absolutely.
The comment was, there's no reason to believe that the people that were involved in this well-planned system saw them as human. They were absolutely seen as cattle, right? As property, right? And property lost is property paid. You got that? It was business, right? And it was a very successful and effective business. Yes?
The aha for me was the insurance.
Yes. Oh, I'm going to unpackage that a little later. So the question was, the aha for this person was this idea of ensuring your future slave capture, enslavement, transport, right? Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about disembarkment, all right? Thank you very much.
We'll take 10.
Yes.
I just want to make one or two points before I move on to disembarkment, because we are following the transatlantic slave route. You know, we're following that line of the historical moment, which is unclear because, again, who writes history? We're filling these history stories in with what now African scholars are excavating in their interpretation of these things. And so even though, quote, from the European point of view, the New World wasn't discovered until 1492, we have no idea what was happening, you know, for those 10 centuries from other countries and other parts of the world. Let's never forget the Silk Road and all the transportation in that part of the world that was happening. So just remember that we're looking at the transatlantic slave trade, which we're connected to as a nation, because are the Anglo roots of this country, of our country, right? No judgment here. I just want you to get the concept. And the second thing is that the technology, the transport, and the capture and the enslavement required technology to do this. So sometimes we forget that globalization just didn't happen last week. It has always been where human beings have always been curious of each other, in contact with each other, then in conflict with each other, and then trying to find some sort of peace with others, right? So this process is part of the human experience, right? And there have been long periods of peace. People have found, by the way, when they look at the indigenous people's history in this part of the world, what they know is they had 500 years of fighting too, which culminated in the Great Law of Peace, which is a document that Benjamin Franklin literally modeled the Albany Plan on, which became part of our documentation. So go back and do your homework and read that, right? So what's important is that we're trying to look at the simultaneity of things happening in the world in which enslaved population played a part. Let's go to disembarkment, please. Next slide. You know, where did they land most frequently? They landed in Brazil, in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and in Charleston. I'm not going to spend the time giving the numbers. I did pull the numbers. But I do want to say that after disembarkment, they were auctioned by the companies that had owned them. So while they were on the ship, they were owned. They had been branded, right? They knew what group they were part of. Once they got off the ship, there were people to meet them to do the work. So there was a whole cadre of people who were doing the work of making disembarkment effective, right? The company's representatives and staffs would be there to do the work, and besides, many people found slave auctions entertaining and a marvel. So you can now read kind of the family diaries of people, just like when people in our country went to see slave lynchings. In parts of Europe, they went to see slave auctions, right, in parts of the New World and in parts of Europe, because they had never seen people like this, right? So they would go, this was a kind of an entertainment. And so we have documentation of that. Traffickers, interestingly enough, had very high status. They were met at the tables of the aristocracy, and they would tell these wild stories in the same way that people had read dime novels about the Wild Wild West in our country. People found them fascinating because they were out there in the world doing. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying that this, we have documentation of this now. Those that were not sold were often the weakers. Those people who had survived obviously were stronger, but they were making a distinguish with disembarkment with whether or not those people were going to be field workers or whether they were going to be domestic workers. And many times the injuries or the, let's get crazy here, shake your head, the crazies ended up doing housework, believe it or not, right? And it was the way that they felt that many slaves fainted, they pretended to have this so that they wouldn't be and do the heavy field work. This is a typical sign that was put out when the slave ships were coming by a slave. And they often thought that if a slave had scars on their back, an enslaved person, that was probably going to be a better worker. of all things, right? Not just that they would run away, right? They had a habit of also cutting off the two toes of the slave in order to keep them from running. They auctioned children, and they had places for slaves until they were sold. Next slide, please. I want to talk very quickly about the physical and psychological impact. The major impact began with capture, separation from families and communities. There was a deep fear of not knowing what was going to be happening. Everybody close your eyes for a minute if you're comfortable. Imagine, put your hands out in front of you. Imagine having somebody pull you away and you have no idea for 3 months where you are. You're standing in garbage and filth and smelling and being put in dungeons and close up to other people. You have no idea. That's what they lived with. That is what they experienced. And that is a psychological impact of losing a sense of security and a sense of yourself and a sense of owning and controlling your own body. Many of these characteristics created deep fears that we now associate with hypervigilance, emotional trauma, and PTSD symptoms of people who are in war. Yes?
How did the Europeans communicate with the slaves?
They had... How did the Europeans communicate with the enslaved population? They often didn't. They had middle people. And by this time, they were just like, how many people saw the movies in which they saw the Last of the Mohicans? You remember that? How many people seen some version of that? Well, one of the implications of that movie was that they were mixing indigenous people with Europeans, and those people would grow up in the service of, you know, the communities and to represent the interests in America. This is the same thing they would do with the middle person. The middle person was bred, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, right? Which is going to be astounding. They branded, being branded before transport put them into categories, as I already said, that contradicted their enslaved population's cultures. They didn't want people together that were similar. They wanted people that were dissimilar. The traffickers used violence and sexual assault and rape to get them to conform. If they knew they had children and they were connected with someone, they would threaten them, right, through the middle person. So who was a significant, important person? The middle person, right? They also developed a form of entertainment in which men, that enslaved men would fight each other. This is alleged. There's a little evidence of this as a form of entertainment. So when we think of those boxers being heavyweight champions of the world, this began in the institution of disembarkment because they used to like to watch them fight. They were forced to strip naked and dance so that their sex organs can be seen publicly. There is evidence of this written in journals. And one of they were forced to have sex with an enslaved virgin as entertainment, and this was a paying customer viewing activity alone. Now, what do you say? W-H-A-T? What? These are alleged. There's evidence. There's a wonderful book called The Breeding of Slaves in which this is talked about. There was one more hideous practice called bull bending. And this was a private event among traffickers who raped men as a form of public humiliation to show dominance and to create a threat to any form of resistance. Every one of these practices were legal, right? They were legal. They weren't illegal. And they were part of the process of keeping slaves enslavable so that they could make money, right? All right. The psychological abuses of rape, humiliation were 24/7, and being constrained added to this fight, flight, rage, temperament on the one hand of many enslaved people, and on the other side, a shutdown, withdrawn, not use language, deer in a headlight, suicidal, repetitious suicidal behavior on the part of others. Children that were born later in the Middle Passage, grew up in slavery, did not show many of these kinds of symptoms. Other symptoms, but not these. Next slide, please. The secrets of enslavement, I'm not going to spend much time just to only point out that later, in particular, enslaved women's bodies were used for science, so there was a parallel connection between how slaves' bodies were used and the development of the science, and particularly in our country. It was alleged in Europe, particularly, that some that went to the Caribbean, the enslaved people that went to the Caribbean and French-speaking countries, this is alleged, that they became part of slave brothels for men who were homosexual at that time. The idea of the term, you ever heard that word, where they're the strongest slaves breed with their mothers, and there's a word that people use when they're making a joke, mother what? Don't say it, I don't want to hear it. But that word is supposed to have had its origin out of the slave experience. And this need to keep this perception that slaves were docile and weak, where slaves were taught not to look in the eye of anybody that had more power than them. All right, and later lynching was not just an activity used against men, but out of the 5,000 African Americans, in particular in terms of our history of lynching, out of 5,000 slaves lynched, 200 were women, and some of them were children. Next slide. So there were some dynamics with regard to gender that is part of the story. There was a different reaction to enslaved women because they were the most vulnerable. It is estimated that enslaved Africans, it was only 5 women captured in every 100. When the value of women being part of the capture became prevalent, then that number shifted to 20 for every 100 men because they could produce children. Women were pregnant, were not wanted, they were difficult to manage and often left to die en route. They were the ones who had the most personal trauma relative to repetitive rape, separation, and death of their children, and they were forced to operate outside of traditional gender roles to become leaders, strong, aggressive. In fact, there's a series of stories, someone has written a book which they looked at slave rebellions, and that was 13% of the slave ships had rebellions. And what they found is they were often led by women, because women were not chained in the bottom of the boat, they were on top. They could see what was happening. They learned to communicate, pass messages. They were the cooks, they fed the slaves, and they could engineer a way of passing on information for their, to get at least to have some sort of resistance on the ship. They assisted, as I said, in the revolts, and by the end of the voyage, women were convinced that they were, in many ways, if the ships were returned, I think they estimated that there were 8 ships that were literally returned to some site where the slaves had disembarked and lived in their own communities, but not many of those kinds of things happened. There was a kind of a forced equality between enslaved men and women because of what they had to endure. But there was also a kind of a dislike and a disrespect for enslaved women because they used their sex as a way to get favors. So they were coerced on the one hand, but on the other hand they were disliked because they used those favors to protect their children or whoever their family members were. So it is a serious contradiction. The Omina Castle is it's a profound place to see, but they had, when women were pregnant in the Omina Castle, they were put in a separate place until they had their children. They were able to nurse their children until they were 4. When the children were 4 years old, 3 or 4, they put the children in the school inside of the castle because they were going to raise them to take over the administrators' roles, and then the women were put back into slavery. They estimated that there were about 5 million mixed-race people in the first couple of 100 years of slavery. Where would they have lived? Well, how would they have been identified, right? Okay? In those numbers, most of those people came from the Omina Castle. Remember, the Omina Castle is 537 years old as of today. What created this to be such a propensity was that Europeans did not bring their wives to their trafficking jobs, if you will. The women were later sent back to slavery. Next slide, I'm going to go faster now, okay? There was even more. During the embarkment, they were sold into slavery. Their gender abuses and humiliations were forced to have sexual liaisons with masters. They were forced to give away their mixed-race children in fear of reprisal for the mistress. By the way, there's now a fantastic new book out about how it is that southern plantation owners were fearful of their daughters being abused when they married, right? So they started a practice of having them give their young daughters slaves, and creating marriage statutes that if they married, the slave always stayed with her, so that she would have some form of wealth, right? And so a woman would marry her slave-owning husband, and she would have 12 slaves, and he would have 80, and she would always have life and death over those slaves that she brought into that marriage. So the contradiction is, if her partner was in liaison with those, then she was brutal to those slaves. So that they're now confiscating and looking at the kind of diaries that talk about these stories, and the statutes that are in the South for white women. Women were forced to nurse children that were not their own, and they had to be a signal of stigmatism loving a child that was mixed race, right? I want to stop for a minute. I want to give you a moment to dyad with someone talk. Now, how are you seeing how these gender dynamics and sexual harassment and sexuality and these practices complicated the story? Hands out. Remember I talked about that roots made it together, that people started talking? One of the reasons that people didn't want to talk is because these were the intimate relationships that were complicated, because they made statements about people's identities. So share with someone what's an aha for you, what's a surprise, what's blowing your mind, and then I'll give you a few minutes to talk. Go for it, talk. Oh my goodness, start there.
I guess they went from just products to something a little bit more. They were still suppressed views, but
it's interesting that when she said they were forced to nurse babies that were not their own, and I think it's the term witness, we still use that. And I don't think it's a term of
no, they may have been forced, but whites were using it too. But they just hired a witness. In fact, you often read about that with royalty. Queen or princess of a child that would get a witness and she would basically this.
And women today, freeze their breast milk and give it away and stuff like that.
Okay, time. I'm sorry I'm not giving you a lot of time, but I want to get to some of the juicy stuff. I want to have my time for the juicy stuff at the end.
No problem.
I want one person to share what they shared with their dyad partner. Any one person? Nobody in the back has spoken, so please. I'm going to call on you, Jan. I'm going to call on somebody. No, okay, great, yes.
I was in the Navy, and James George, a tall black kid, we became good friends.
Yes.
And we still communicate. He lives in Great Lakes area. We talk a couple times a year.
And that's what you shared. So he shared the story of a friendship, an interracial friendship that he's maintained in his life, right? Hands out here, everybody. Can you imagine what it has taken, given the history of this civilization, this global institution of slavery, and our particular history with it, in order to be able to do that? It's incredible, right? It is absolutely incredible. So one of my thinking as a diversity trainer is to always remind people that, the work is not always in the protest, it's in the relationships that you create with people, right? Very important, right? Because no one is born excluded, no one is born racist, no one is born those things. Those are choices and things that you're forced to be. I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm going to move fast now, right? Good. So I think it's important for you to get a sense that those castles, those 40 castles along the West Coast, and we're not talking about the other routes, right? That those are like museums to an institution. They have been turned into museums. And many, many people, average people, visit these castles. Steve Harvey recently went, and I certainly went on the year of the return. I went with a group of 161 people, and we revisited. I went when I was 19, and I went when I was 66. But Steve Harvey, the talk show host, said, "This was real pain. I felt going back to Ghana's slave castles. I could feel my ancestors on me. Powerful, powerful words, things I couldn't explain. I encourage as many of you as possible to go home and see your ancestors. Their strength is still there in each and every one of us. It helps us remember the sacrifice that they made for us." Another person on the trip said, "Through the DNA test, I found out who my descendants were. I no longer had to put my head down in school when people said, 'Where are your people from?' I actually knew the tribe that I was from. I went to Ghana because they were close to that slave castle, and I had a powerful reunion with the families that are also those particular tribes. I may have come from an enslaved person, but I know my history." Another person said, "This is a painful thing to see how human beings were so cruel. What was in their mind of these people who participated in the enslavement? I would love to know. I do not know if I can ever forgive them. These castles are such reminders of the wrong and the pain and their responsibility to make it right." Next slide, please. I want you to know that the Elmina Castle was preserved by the as a Ghanaian National Museum. It's a monument that was designated by the World Heritage Monument Act in UNESCO in 1979. Elmina has about 41,000 foreign tourists a year, at least in 2016 they did, and they're continually to do renovations. So when I went at 19 with this man over here on a date, he was really trying to impress me, and he did. We went, and you couldn't get inside of the slave castle, the dungeons. They weren't excavated. When I went this time, they were excavated and open, so you could actually walk in them and stand in them, and they put electricity up. I went a week after Nancy Pelosi and Representative Omar, who left a wreath there on behalf of the American people. The Cape Coast Castle has a recorded 70,000 foreign tourists each year. The number of domestic tourists, those are Ghanaians and Africans that visit, are about 88,000 in the year 2000. Both dungeon and castles together record over 100,000 people who visit every year. So we can look at other Holocaust monuments around the world that are always reminders, right? Next slide, please. Now I want to tell you a story. So, in 2015, this is me, I'm visiting the castle, and this is one of the excavated dungeons, and you can go into it now. And so I went in, and there was a guide, and I said, what is that? What is all that stuff on the floor? And he said, in 2015, 35 African Americans came to the slave castle and asked permission, could they do a reenactment and stay in the castle from 6 at night till 6 in the morning. They wanted, and what they did is took off all of their clothes and wrapped these rags around themselves, put chains on themselves, and they wanted to experience what that was like. So they dressed like slaves, they changed themselves, and they stood in the dungeon while the light went out. Sunlight was very limited. They began at 6 p.m. and the internal doors shut. There was no light. Soon the smells and the winds of the sea was there. Imagine that. Within 30 minutes, 15 people left. Some made it for 3 hours. About 10 people left. The majority left by midnight, and 5 had to be hospitalized. Only 5 of them made it till 6 o'clock in the morning. Only 5. So I could barely stand to stay in this place. Just, if you look at African societies, many of them, they are ancestor worshiping societies. And in being so, they believe that spirits are part of their everyday life, right? They worship them, they protect them, they're extremely important. So that it wasn't unusual at all for people to have all kinds of feelings when they would walk into these slave castles. Because if you were a person of African descent, you were a descent of somebody from this castle or one of the others. So it was, I want to play something for you, and I won't play it for a very long time, but it is to give you a sense of how impactful it was when people visited the castle. Let's see if I can do this. Technology is not my strong suit. All right, here we go. I'm going to stop it there because you got the essence of what I wanted to say. She was my roommate, by the way, on the trip. I never met her at all, and we were roommates. And by the time we went to the castle, she had what they call in the tradition there a walk-in, and she was expressing the hurt and the rage and the sorrow. This is a very typical reaction. When I was 19 and I went to the slave castle, I wanted to punch somebody out. That was my reaction as a 19-year-old. When they asked you to sign that book and make your comments, right? That wasn't my reaction this time. My reaction was, you know, Ghana has made such a powerful, never again lesson from this castle that is marvelous. And this castle is visited by so many foreign visitors as a reparation and a tribute to that awful, awful experience. Next slide, please. We're getting there. Next slide, please. The point I want to make is that in the first presentation, we talked about European nations that were involved in trafficking for over, in particular, with the history of our country for 243 years. The next slides expose the mechanism of worldwide trafficking system as it became part of the American experience, right? Not just the Americas, right? I want to repeat again that these parts of this system, capture, enslavement, transport, and disembarkment, were businesses, right? They were well financed. This means that someone benefited, made a profit, provided money and resources, human and material, and created wealth. That is one of the things that historians tell us might be the reason they call it the slave coast, the Gold Coast, although my husband disputed that with me this morning. Next slide, please. So what I did is pull together a body of research about the companies that were actually involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And the biggest companies built the fortresses, were legally chartered, and they had private investors. So in other words, somebody could invest a percentage of money and make profit and never be part in a physical way with slavery at all, right? The enslavement. The first things, remember, that were traded before it was human cargo was gold and ivory and spices, and those things were extremely important and raised the per capita of the countries of origin that these ships left from. The Dutch East, raise your hand if you've heard of any of these companies. The Dutch East Indian Company, this is the one that they are in the textbooks, right? The British East Indian Company, many of us have heard of it. The Swedish African Company, They actually were not involved in human cargo, but they did a lot of gold and timber, and they transported traffickers there. So they had traffickers of their ethnicity, but they didn't actually do the trafficking, right? They were like the employment agency, if you will, right? Dutch companies and French companies were just too numerous to measure. Between 1620, 1612, and 1872, the Dutch operated at least 10 fortresses on the Gold Coast, which is now called Ghana, from which slaves were shipped across the Atlantic. The Dutch part in the Atlantic slave trade is estimated between 5 and 7%, and about 500,000 to 600,000 Africans were enslaved and brought. Next slide, please. Who profited? I want you to read this list. I want you to look at some of the things that they were involved in. You know some of these companies? I bet you do, right? So, interestingly enough, brilliant college students did the research of these companies and looked back at their histories. You know, one of the things that European cultures did, that I actually love as a descendant of Anglo roots too, is that they kept good records. Whereas many cultures didn't keep records. That was not part of their sort of cultural milieu, right? So we can actually, so those students that did the kind of research goes all the way back to when these companies had multiple names. J.P. Morgan didn't always have this name. They had other names, right? When we're talking over 300 or 400 period. But these are the ways in which they were involved in insurance. Now, who did they insure? The trafficker, the companies, right? A number of slaves. Oops, I knew that was going to happen. Sorry, didn't turn mine off. All right, next slide. Here are some other names. Some of these may have come from, you may know of some of these companies because they have divisions in the towns that you grew up in the cities that you grew up in, maybe or maybe not. So even though we don't have the institution of slavery, the impact, oh my God, the impact is continued to be felt by who accumulates the money and where and how that money is used. By the way, some of these banks and places engage in practices that didn't give people of African descent any loans so they can have houses. Didn't give them money when they got out of the service after serving their country. Many of these companies have banks that did this, right? Okay, loaning practices that were racist, straight out. So when the students began to do the research on any of these companies, it was amazing. In fact, I met one young man when I was at the University of Iowa doing my PhD, and he was writing about a company, you know, who had slave trade practices. All right? Next slide, please. Schools also benefit. You know any of these schools? You know a school that's not up there? Grinnell College. But these schools now are doing forms of reparation, right? Where people who are proven descendants of slaves, enslaved peoples. But these universities have very unique histories. There was one president, the president of Dartmouth College was fired, who supported slavery and wanted his school to be a slave, invest money in slave trading, and of course he was fired and the school did not. The wealthy elites married within each other, went to these schools because their ideal was that they were going to one day govern. They married, they lived, they shared this slave money, and higher education was a way to gain prestige and status and wealth. I think we call them Ivy League schools, huh? I didn't go to one. I went to a better school, University of Iowa. I shouldn't have done that. All right. I just love Iowa. Next slide, please.
What was that lower picture?
You want to put it back?
That
Yes. One of the things is that many of these schools are trying to not ignore their African presence, so they're building gardens of slave heads on their campuses to remind us not to be forgotten their role. So this is kind of called activist art. Huh? It's very powerful. And in doing so, they now have photographic pictures, many of these institutions in their archives, of slaves that worked in the houses that looked like, we actually have evidence This isn't made up, all right? A couple more slides, and we're going to move. I'm going to stop. U.S. presidents owned slaves. Look at these numbers. Incredible. Look at these numbers. Many of these presidents did not free their slaves. Right? Look at the numbers. This is 12 U.S. presidents. There's a great book called 12 U.S. Presidents Owned Slaves. Look at the numbers. Next slide, please. Look at the numbers. Right? Even during the Civil War. Right? And finally, slavery was part of the lives of the seat of the highest people who ran the United States. They owned slaves. Families managed plantations. Most of them reconciled slavery with the highest ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. You already know all of that. A large number of Anglo presidents were Scottish-Irish, and many of them, their families had, and Irish too, and had fled for freedom and participated. By the way, one of my favorite songs is a poem, though, called Paddy's Lament, about how Irish immigrants came to America, fought in the Civil War, a war which had no basis of their experience, and then were later not paid. So they talk about how they would rather go back to Ireland and starve than stay in America and participate in slavery, or fight against those who are doing slavery. Next slide, please. I want to stop by saying that, to me, most of my life, the more that I got education, the more I found myself in situations where I wasn't with people that looked like me, that the writers of the books I read did not have my interest in heart, told stories about the people who were enslaved in which they were negative, and it's almost as if it was their fault. So I got personally interested in this from the standpoint that I thought that if studying the stages of trafficking, you know, and showing how millions of African people left the New World, it is a beautiful reflection of Western civilization. But it's also part of our American story. And I think that we should prepare more young people how to talk about it, because it is their future and how we're going to resolve this new global moment that we're in. Like, Africa is going to remain underdeveloped, like other parts of the world, all right, unless we do something about it. So if you know the story, then it's easier to decide, in my mind, what is going to be your grain of salt, how you're going to help in whatever way you can. And I don't think there's no one way to help more than others. But I do think that the lessons tell us that it is not inevitable that we repeat this, and we certainly don't repeat it in the same way. So I think the study of slavery is a study of our institutional record, but also our moral record, because slavery also ended, right? So in the next presentation that I do, we're going to talk about the cost and the impact on Africa, the continent itself, to be depopulated, how that then impacted what happened in terms of slave practices in the United States, and then talk about what some young people are doing globally to sort of offset this story, because as my husband pointed out, the only African in this room from Ethiopia, his society is 3,000 years old. Imagine that, right? Imagine that, right? All right, who live with Muslims, who live with diversity, way before the United States experience, right? That we're going to be learning from how people live in these countries with less than, right? And and it's young people that we hope will have these conversations, and they'll be able to do it without having to feel such shame, that they will have much more practice and experience in doing so, and certainly I had, and maybe some of you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do I have 2 minutes? I do have 1 minute or two?
Like 1 minute.
All right, well, did anybody want to close us out? Do you want to say anything? How's your heart beating? How are you feeling right now?
Sobering, I think.
Yes.
I feel guilty.
Okay?
I can't help it. I do.
All right.
And my ancestors were Scotch-Irish.
And I think some of mine were too. She says she feels guilty. And some of mine, I don't know how I got the name Scott, but somewhere in there I got it, right? But you know what? It's not just how we feel, because sometimes our feelings are not facts. It's also what we do about it. Because let me tell you something, I think you were the person who said, I read Roots before it came on television, right? So this is a person who had an awareness. I want to thank you for that, right?
Thank you so
Have a
much,
good day.
Kesho, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.